Alleluia. Good evening, everyone. Around this time of year, there is a poem that I regularly read by Jan Richardson. It is called A Blessing for Mary Magdalene. And the final part of the poem goes like this. All you need to remember is how it sounded when you stood in the place of death and heard the living call your name. All you need to remember is how it sounded when you stood in the place of death and heard the living call your name. In my second trip to Cambodia, I visited a school. And it was a bit of an unusual school in the heart of Phnom Penh, the bustling capital city. It was one of those days in May that is just absolutely hot. But it was the time in the afternoon when the sun made everything gold, and the sun was shining down through the courtyard of this open-air school. And there were these huge trees with big white blossoms, and they made the air smell so sweet. And there were little birds chirping. But the school itself was silent. In fact, there were no children in the school. There were no desks in any of the classrooms. In the classrooms, there were beds that had been bolted to the wall, bed frames. And there were shackles and chains that had been bolted to the floor. On the walls, there were portraits of people who had been tortured and killed in this school that was transformed during the Khmer Rouge era into Tuol Sleng Museum, Tuol Sleng Prison, now Tuol Sleng Museum. It is a place where absolute, undeniable horror happened. A place where once children played and learned and had an opportunity for a better life was transformed into this vast void. Void of humanity, void of reason, void of sense. You can't imagine how many people died in such a small space. I bore witness to it that day, to the nail marks that were gouged into the stone of the floor, to all of the cabinets full of bones. And as we left that museum, the prison, we walked outside into the bustling Phnom Penh thoroughfare. And I didn't know what to do with the juxtaposition between what I had seen and would now remember for the rest of my life and what I was seeing around me on those city streets. Because Cambodia is a place, a piece of my heart. It is a place I have always associated with vibrant, beautiful life. I think of it as a rainbow. You have the deep red earth, the emerald trees, the brilliant white of the cows, the sapphire sky. Someone is always playing music somewhere, as if to say, I'm awake too. You're not alone. There's the smell of cooking. There's motorcycles zipping by. There's children running errands, running under feet, helping out their parents. There's sound, there's life, and it's beautiful. But what I had seen in that prison was the absolute face of human suffering, was the lengths that humans can go to hurt and torture and destroy each other. That prison was used specifically to kill people who were educated. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, nurses, even people with glasses were brought there under the threat that maybe they had had some extra learning or knew how to read. It was systematic. And to this day, it haunts me, remembering all of that. I don't think prior to that point in my life I had stood in a place of death like that. And And as I returned to the outer world, there was something in me that was different. In our gospel story today, we have this situation. We have Mary, who had borne witness, perhaps longer than any of the other disciples, to the absolute depravity and cruelty of humankind. Rereading the stories last night of how the crucifixion happened, how there was this incredible pain associated with it, how you weren't even free from torture when you were on the cross, that your legs could still be broken as you were dragged down. Can you imagine where you have to go in your mind to do that to another human being? It's hard for me to fathom. But our Mary did not look away. We read in the Gospels that she and some of the other women were present, if from afar, with Jesus until the very end. And we read that she, among with others, were there when he was taken down from the cross and helped lay him in the tomb. She bore witness to his suffering. She bore witness until the very, very end. And tonight we bear witness to her. If you imagine the tomb, imagine the scene. Imagine Mary stumbling her way in the dark to that site of death, to the place where Jesus' suffering was laid to rest, but where his pain still hung in the air. How could it not, being so immense? Imagine her stumbling her way to the dark. I imagine that her eyes must have ached from crying, that maybe it was hard to see. Maybe she tripped over a rock. Maybe she felt her way along through familiar landmarks. And she probably didn't even think of the stone because she knew she'd never be able to move it by herself anyway. But maybe she just wanted to lean against it to say, I'm still here. I am here and I'm not going anywhere in the face of your suffering, Jesus. I will remember. But then she gets there, and this incredible thing has happened. The stone has been moved. And what's more, she peers into the dark and it's empty. What would that have been like? She runs back, and what's amazing about this to me is that she does not feel the hope, not that we know of, not that we read in the text. There's not a sign that she believed, or she was hopeful, or she was like, oh, maybe this is it. This is what he foretold. No, we don't get any of that in the text. But she runs back to the disciples, and she says, and we can maybe picture the despair in her voice, they have taken my Lord, and I don't know where they have laid him. Perhaps because she was so close to his suffering, she is one of the last to feel that resurrection promise bloom in her heart, because she bore witness the longest. I imagine that in her mind she was saying, what now? What could they possibly do to him now that they haven't already done? Maybe she was afraid the soldiers were going to take Jesus' body and make an example of him and say, this is what happens when you challenge Rome. This is the way the world is supposed to work. Cruelty, control, power, that's what wins the day. Not your precious love and mercy and peace. And so she brings two of the disciples back to the tomb. And they have this little relay race to see who can get there first. And it's fascinating. The disciple who remains unnamed, some commentaries say it's meant to be us, that we can insert ourselves into that person. They're the one who has this inkling of hope, this wondering in their heart that maybe something is happening here. And Peter looks and he's confused and he's puzzled. But neither of them are despairing as they go away from the tomb. By now we can imagine that the stars have started to fade from the sky. Maybe the night chill has begun to fade from the air. We start to hear the first sleepy songs of birds. The flowers are starting to open. And there's Mary. And she is still weeping weeping even as the angels appear and are sitting in the place of death and asking her, "Why are you weeping?" It's almost as if she couldn't even see them. She was so locked in her despair in that place of death. If you have ever stood in the face or place of death, if you have ever looked into the yawning void of grief, if you have ever borne witness to absolute pain, perhaps you can also understand why it took Mary the longest to get there. Because she had this depth of love. Because she was showing the way before Jesus even appeared of what love looks like, of how the way and the truth is through suffering. The only way through suffering is to love. That is the only thing that we can do. That is what will lead us into resurrection. And so she turns, and perhaps we can imagine here that the sun finally bursts above the horizon. It's extending its fingers above the horizon, and it dazzles her eyes. Maybe she didn't see that it was Jesus. Or, again, if you've ever been in the place of death and somehow loved your way through, you're a different person. You're not the same as you were before. And maybe that goes for Jesus too. Having witnessed what he did, having lived and endured what he did for our sake, Jesus looked and sounded a little different too. And this is the moment. Here we are. When he says to Mary, "Why are you weeping?" And here, still locked in her despair, she says, "They have taken my Lord. I don't know where they have taken him." But here we get a glimpse into what kind of God we serve, the God that brought all of us here tonight. Here we have a God who calls us out of the place of death by name, Mary. And in that moment, she sees him. She realizes it's him. And she proclaims, "Teacher, Rabboni, teacher." This intimate relationship that she had had with him his whole ministry. How incredible that this is the way that we are led to life. That Mary bears witness to the absolute depths of human depravity and cruelty. And she doesn't flinch away. She doesn't turn away in fear. Instead, she loves with all that she has through it, just as Jesus did. We read that he did not raise a hand against those who had hurt him, but instead he loved fiercely, even to the end. This is our command this day. This is the work that we get to do as resurrection people. We are called now to bear witness to each other's suffering and to say, the way through is love. It's not just this happy ending where the credits roll and every plot thread is wrapped up. Resurrection is not an easy thing. It's a gritty and real thing that comes upon us. But this is where resurrection begins, with each of us loving our way through it because we have been loved. Jesus rising ahead of us, Jesus dying so that we would know how to live. As the poem goes, "And now you do not know how to abide by this hole in the center of your chest, where a door swings open and slams shut at the same time, turning on the hinge of your aching, hopeful heart. I tell you, this is not a banishment from the garden. It is an invitation and a choice, a threshold, a gate. This is your life, calling to you from a place you never could have dreamed. But now that you have glimpsed its edge, you cannot imagine choosing any other way. So let the tears come as anointing, as consecration, and then let them go. Let this blessing gather itself around you. Let it give you what you will need for the journey. You will not remember the words. They do not matter. All you need to remember is how it sounded when you stood in the place of death and heard the living call your name. Alleluia, Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia.